Hi everyone, this is Matthew Jennifer Carboners, and I'm here with Cutoff vs. Button vs. Blind Play Part 5, 3 betting from the big blind. So I'm going to try to get to the heart of the content quite quickly for this video, but before we jump in, I want to discuss the goals for this video. I'm going to randomly generate a bunch of board textures, assuming we're in the big blind, and 3-bet preflop. I'll also assume the cutoff calls. I'll then try to quickly figure out what hands go into what ranges quickly to mimic limited decision time while playing. As you know from my last few videos, I'm trying to give you an idea of what I do quickly because you don't have time to write out all the hand combos when you're actually playing. I'll try to guess the equity of each range as we see the flop, as this will help us determine how aggressively to bet. I'll then try to account for every hand on my own off screen, then discuss the spot again. I'm hoping to be able to do this for at least 3 flops. So I'm going to randomly generate 3 flops, maybe 4 or 5 if some of the flops are boring. We'll discuss them quickly, what I think we should do, and then I'll actually spend the time off screen writing everything down to see how far off my original guess was for what I think we should do if I had, more time to think about it and try to get some things to, balance a little bit better. So a lot of the work for this video is going to be done off screen, which actually should hopefully make this video a little more fun to watch because you're going to get to see all the work that I've done presented to you immediately rather than watch me do it. All right, so let's jump in. So now what I've done is I've taken the big blind 3 betting range, which is this range right here, and put it in Equilab. And I've also put in the cutoff 3-bet flatting range, which is this range right here, and also put in Equilab. And I'm going to evaluate the equity just to remind us that the big blind 3 betting range has 53.5% equity, and the cutoff 3-bet calling range has 46.5% equity. So not a huge jump in equity for how, for the fact that, the cutoff is getting about 2-to-1 odds pre-flop and has the advantage of position. But just look, this is a condensed range that the cutoff's calling with, so it's pretty hard to realize the equity with a lot of these hands. Like, it's not that easy to realize the equity of King Jack off or Jack 9 suited, whereas the big blind 3 betting range has a very polarized 3 betting range, not extremely polarized. It's still 3 betting, king, queen, and some hands like ace 5 suited that would very clearly make, quite profitable calls, I think, pre-flop. But it is overall a pretty polarized range with a lot of hands that don't have a lot of equity, like 7-6 suited, but have very robust equity. So that equity is much easier to realize than a hand that doesn't have as robust of equity. Okay, so I randomly generated the first board texture, which was the 10 of diamonds, 9 of spades, 3 of clubs. Started talking about it, ended up not making sense, so I restarted the recording. So let me repeat what I said earlier and repeat the guess for the equity I made that was wrong. So the first thing I said was when we get this board texture, it hits the cutoff 3-bet calling range very well, but it really whiffs our 3-betting range from the big line. We're not 3-betting like really any 10x hands. I don't even know if we have a single one. Hold on. We might literally not have one top. Yeah, we don't have a single top pair hand, so the 10 just whiffs us, whereas it's going to really hit the 3-bet calling range. Right? The 3-bet calling range hits a lot of 10x hands. The 9 hits some 3-bet calling hands too, actually quite a bit. No offsuit combos, but still ace 9, king 9, queen 9, jack 9 suited. So this board looks quite bad for the 3-betting range. So my original guess was that the 3-betting range would go from having 53.5% equity to 48.5% equity. So I thought it'd be a pretty big drop in equity, but I even was way off. It's even way bigger than that. The big blind 3-betting range has 44.7% equity on the flop. So in other words, just to show that the big blind 3-betting range lost about 9% equity on this flop. That's horrible. This board texture is absolutely horrible for the 3-better. So now that I'm doing this, I'm realizing that I should have checked the equity afterwards, after I'd already discussed the hand a little bit more, because now I know, hey, look at how much equity our 3-betting range lost. I shouldn't be c-betting that aggressively here. Whereas if I would have originally seen this board texture, I would have thought we would have checked at a pretty high frequency. But I'll be honest, if I'm actually playing cutoff opens, I 3-bet in the big blind, I'm probably going to c-bet on the flop with pocket queens, even if that's a mistake. Because I now know it's a mistake, because even though I would have realized while playing this 10-9 board's probably not very good for our range, I probably wouldn't have realized we have literally no top pairs. I mean, I would have maybe, but I mean, I'd have to have been really thinking. I couldn't have been just like multi-tabling and clicking buttons and said. So like what can happen when you're playing, as I'm sure everyone watching this knows, is if you have pocket queens and you get this flop, you're just usually going to c-bet queens. Like you're not going to really think, wait a second, I don't have any top pair hands in my range. This really nails the cutoff 3-bet calling range. I probably shouldn't even be c-betting queens here, even though queens are kind of, queens look like they should be c-bet here because we 3-bet pre-flop, which means we're usually going to bet, and queens are both like strong and vulnerable, which is usually like the ideal hand to be c-betting with. So I'm sure some people that watch these videos are like really, really, really good, and they might realize that boom right off the bat. But I think most people, myself included, especially if you're playing a lot of tables at once, could easily have ended up c-betting queens here, even if that might be a mistake because our range might just be that weak. So it's hard. I'll not make this mistake in the next two hands. But so for right here, like after having looked at this board texture, I got to be honest. Now I think we should almost not be c-betting as the 3-better because we just got such an awful, awful flop. And if we should be c-betting, it should be like we c-bet like maybe 15% of the time or some real small frequency where we're c-betting like queens and jacks and we're checking, and of course some bluffs, and we're checking most everything else. So I wrote down this hand. I'm going to analyze it and we'll come back to it later. But this board texture just looks about as bad as they come for the big blind 3-betting range. I would have thought it'd be bad, but even I'm surprised at the magnitude of how bad it is. So I think we should be checking at a pretty high frequency here, if not literally 100% of the time. And then we're going to be check raising pretty aggressively too, because we do have, some really good hands in our range that are strong and vulnerable. Okay, so let's randomly generate the next board. And again, I'll write out all the stuff for this and we'll come back to it in just a couple minutes. All right, so ace, 9, 4. I will look at the equity later to not be biased for what I'm going to say I'll do in a minute. But I think our equity actually would increase on this flop. If I remember correctly, ace high boards were actually pretty good for the 3-betting range in some other situations we talked about, like when we 3-bet in the button called, I believe, or if we 3-bet from the small blind in the cutoff call, I believe. Could be wrong there, but I think the ace is overall good for our range. The 9 probably hits our opponent pretty well and gives some equity to his range, but I think overall we'll probably go from having like 53.5% equity here to like maybe 54.5 or something, like a small increase in equity, maybe even 55%. We hit some nice suited aces, including ace 4, which made 2 pair. The ace 5, the ace 3, and the ace 2, I'll talk about in just a second. But yeah, I think this board's pretty good for our range when we see betting at a pretty high frequency. Okay, so what I would usually do on a board texture like this is, if you're looking for some hands to kind of bet with a 1 street and then check call on the turn, I would use the ace 5, the ace 3, and the ace 2 to do that. Because when we have ace 5, ace 3, and ace 2, and we bet the flop, there's only going to be 2 aces left in the deck. Whereas if we have something like pocket kings or pocket queens, there's going to be 3 aces left in the deck. So like sort of my default plan is like I'm not going to really bet the flop and check call the turn all that often here because our 3-betting range is already pretty polarized. So even though, we will bet the flop and check call the turn sometimes, especially if we get like a club on the turn, for the most part, if the turn card's a blank, like if it's like a 6 of spades, I don't have that big of a flop betting range, turn check calling range. But the hands that I do think work kind of well as that here are actually ace 5, ace 3, and ace 2 for the reasons I just mentioned, and probably even a hand like pocket 10s and maybe even pocket jacks, but probably specifically pocket 10s. Because if we bet pocket 10s on the flop, we can get value from our opponent's 9x's, and if we make our opponent fold his like king, queen, or king, jack, that's cool too, because those hands had a reasonable amount of equity against us. So the hands that I'm going to bet with on the flop to check call with, on the turn probably, we might even bet 10s on the flop and check fold them on the turn, but they'd probably be hands like 10s, ace 5, ace 3, and ace 2. My flop betting range my flop betting range that's going to probably bet multiple streets are going to be just the ace king, the ace queen, and the ace jack. Ace jack might not be able to bet all 3 streets, so ace jack might bet like flop and turn and check call river. I'm not really sure about that, but I don't think ace jack's going to be strong enough to bet all 3 streets on most runouts, but I'd still start with betting it on the flop the same way I would start with betting ace 3 on the flop, although, of course, ace jack's significantly stronger. And then the hands that I would be checking with on the flop would be like pocket aces as like sort of our strong, slow play, tricky hand. And then pocket kings, pocket queens, I would check call with as well. Jacks, I really don't know. They seem kind of on the cusp to me. And then in order to balance out, for value betting ace king and ace queen, we're going to need to have quite a lot of bluffs. So I think we're going to be bluffing with most of this kind of stuff. Almost everything here. Hopefully everyone can see my mouse moving around, but like the 9-7, 8-7, 8-6, 7-6, 7-5, 6-5. Most of them are going to, or half of them are going to have either a flush draw or a backdoor flush draw. And then even the ones that don't, they're often going to be stuff like 8-7 and 8-6 can turn plenty of straight draws. So I think they're still probably okay to c-bet. Although for a hand like that, whenever you're c-betting like a very low equity hand, like 8-6 off here, and when I say 8-6 off, I of course mean like 8-6 of diamonds. always check your opponent's stats. I know that's super obvious, and it's hard to know what to do if you're playing on anonymous tables, but try to have some read before you bet there just because it is such a low equity hand. Some opponents might fold enough that you can very profitably bet any two cards. Others might not fold enough, and you might just be able to exploitatively check fold. I'd be more likely to check fold like king, queen off without the club, because checking might keep some dominated hands in the opponent's range, or if we check and our opponent checks back, we might outdraw him. Like if we check and he checks back with tens and then turns a king or a queen. So like I'd probably look to check like king, queen off without the club. That would be my default. And then, so yeah, king, queen off without the club would probably be my check folding hand. Whereas I think you could even bet king, queen off with the king of clubs because it just has 3 clubs and you can double barrel a club, maybe a jack, and maybe a 10 as well. So yeah, that's my general flop strategy. I think that one's pretty straightforward. But yeah, I'll write down all the combos and we'll talk about it more and see where I was off in just a minute. So before I forget, I want to guess the equity. And I think I'm going to guess about 54% equity. And my reason for that is I think the 9 of clubs is actually pretty good for the 3-bet caller. So pretty good for the cutoff. So I think we would have more equity by quite a bit if like this 9 were like a 7. But with the 9 being a 9, I think we're going to have like 54% equity. So let's check. Okay, cool. So it was close on that one. And just to see, let's make the 9 a 2. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. I have to do it here. Let's make the 9 a 2. And I'm guessing we're going to see like a significant jump in equity for the 3-betting range now. Because the 9 doesn't really hit our 3-betting range, but it hits the 3-bet calling range. So now we might go up to like, I don't know, maybe 57, 58% equity. I think it's going to be a pretty big jump here. Okay, cool. So a little bit more than that even. All right, so this 9 really, so the ace high board does favor the 3-betting range, but the 9 is actually quite good for the 3-bet calling range. And I think that a 10 would be too, but let's check. And I mean, I think I'm already sort of seeing stuff tie together, right? Because we just saw how good the 10 and the 9 were in the last flop. So let's check to see how good the 10 would be. Yeah, the 10 is very similar to the 9. Okay, so yeah, we'll come back to this board in just a minute, but just some stuff to notice before we do. Okay, so let's do at least one more. No whammy, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy. Stop. Seriously? All right, so we just did pretty much exactly that. So I'm going to go again. All right, king, queen, 5. So let me just write that down. Flop number 3. King of hearts, queen of spades, 5 of diamonds. Okay. So I actually think these boards with 2 high cards are kind of easy to play because if you just bet your top pairs and check call your middle pairs, that typically works pretty well. I mean, it's probably not absolutely ideal, but it's not as hard as maybe on like the last board texture where there was only 1 high card on the ace 9-4 where we had to talk about like, okay, so which hands are you betting now to check a call later? Which hands are you betting now to maybe bet all 3 streets? And, you know, you could easily end up check calling on the flop with ace 5, ace 3, and ace 2, even though betting might be a little bit better. Or you could end up betting on the flop with like pocket kings, even though check calling might be a little bit better. So the last one I think was a little bit trickier, but here I really would just, we don't have that many queen X's, I guess, so I really would just check call all the ace queen. I'd bet all the ace king. The kings, the pocket kings, pocket queens are a little bit trickier. I would probably check call the pocket kings and either check raise or bet the pocket queens. Pocket aces I would also bet. And then king, queen, I think are probably going to end up being a mixed strategy. So like king, queen, and queens, like the really, really strong hands we can have that don't really have that bad of a removal effect. King, queen blocks, you know, 1 king X hand, but it also blocks a queen X hand. So at the end of the day, if we have king, queen, there are just less hands our opponent can call with or bet with for value. So I think the king, queen, and the pocket queens should be either bet or check raised. And I'll tweak that in just a few moments when I write everything down. And then for the bluffs, I would pretty much just bet everything that's 3 to a flush, which would be, it's actually really easy to do here, right? Because there's not that many hands that aren't 3 to a flush. It's only going to be the ace 4, ace 3, ace 2, the 9-7, 8-7, 8-6, 7-6 hands that are of clubs. So that means we'll maybe be check folding like 10 hands on the flop. We'll be check folding all those, you know, ace X or 8X or 7X of club hands. And then everything else is either going to get bet, check raise for value, or we also need to check raise bluff a couple hands. So that would be something else that I think I could easily mess up if I were actually playing. So like the ideal check raising hand here might actually be like 5-4 of spades and 5-4 of hearts and 6-5 of spades and 6-5 of hearts. So let me just put those into Flopzilla so you can see what I'm talking about. Like this hand might be a good hand to check raise bluff because it just double barrels very cleanly. If we get a spade on the turn, we can just go all in and we'll have a high equity hand. Or if we turn a 6 or a 5, we're pretty much going to have usually turned the best hand. So I think that would be a mistake I would often make while playing, which is if I had a hand like 6-5 of spades or 5-4 of spades, if I'm playing a lot of tables at once, I would just very easily, bet them because I think betting with them is profitable because 6-5 of spade does make a good hand to, c-bet bluff with. But it might make a better hand to check raise, especially if you think about it. What would really suck is if we double barrel 6-5 of spades and our opponent ships on the turn. So maybe, I don't know, maybe it's better to just check raise 6-5 of spades. I'll write out all the hand combos again in just a moment, but I just think it's a good example of a spot where I think people usually have an easier time seeing the hands to check raise for value, like pocket queens or king queen here, but they might miss the hands to check raise bluff. And it's something where if I was, playing more, especially if I was playing on like stars, if I could play against like the same regs and get a bigger data sample, I'd be pretty curious to see how effective check raising in 3-bet pots is. And I'm sure you'll get different results at different limits, but it might be one of those things where you might just get way too many folds, or you might be able to check raise and your opponents won't ship very often, and in which case, as we talked about, it's pretty cool if you can just check raise 6-5 of spades and then get to see the turn card, because then you can, just check fold if you whiff, ship if you hit a spade, ship if you hit a 5, ship if you hit a 6. So pretty easy to do. So now let's get the equity. All right, so I think the king is definitely going to be good for us and the queen's going to be bad. So I think it's going to be pretty similar to before, where it's just going to be like, 53.5% equity, 53, 52, 54% equity. I think the same amount of equity that we had in the 3-betting range pre-flop will mostly be on the flop. Maybe a little bit less than that since we 3-bet some ace-x suiteds. All right, so let's guess 51 or 52% equity for the 3-betting range. Okay, so 53. Okay, cool. So the magic of cinema is going to just make it seem like no time has passed, but I'm going to go spend probably a couple hours writing out these hands on a Word document. So I'll see you in like 2 minutes. All right, so I just did all the hand combos for the 3 board textures, and I took some notes. And yeah, let's just jump in with the 10-9-3 rainbow board. So whenever I start with a board texture where it looks like our range is significantly weaker than the opponent's, I always start with assuming we always check. And by that, I mean, I start out looking at how would I defend my range or how would I play my range if I always started out by checking. And then if I find that I'm defending too many combos after checking, then that means I should have a betting range. So most people look at their defending their checks as like an afterthought. Whereas in reality, what you want to first make sure is if you do ever check, you want to make sure you're defending your checks aggressively enough. And then once you know you're defending your checks a little bit too much, then you can start to develop that betting range. So a betting range is basically a luxury you have when your range is about as strong or stronger than your opponent's. And in this case, I didn't think our range was stronger than our opponent's on the 10-9-3 board since we only had like 44% equity. So I started off, just checking our entire range, which was 123 combos. So I had 123 when I did this. I don't know why it's saying 125 now. But probably not a huge deal. Let me see if I have something clicked. No, I don't know why we're 2 combos off, to be honest. But either way, that's not hugely important. So yeah, so I had 123 combos, and I wanted to write out how to defend all those. So what I did was use a mixture of check calling and check raising. But I really emphasize check raising here because we do have so many good hands in our range. And we also don't want to let our opponent realize his equity very cheaply. So it was kind of a weird situation where, I'm always checking, but once I do check, I actually defend a lot of our checks by check raising. And I think that makes sense because we have a lot of good hands in our range or a lot of very good hands in our range, but we have no mediocre or no pretty good hands in our range, or at least we have very few. So because of that, that encouraged us, I think, to check raise, or that encouraged us to defend our checks by check raising more aggressively than we usually do. We usually check call much, much, much more often than we check raise. Whereas right here, since I'm check raising 30 combos and check calling 45, I'm actually check raising 2 combos for every 3 that I check call. So let's first go over the check raises. I check raised kings, queens, and half of the jacks. And the reason why I did that was I think these hands are strong enough to check raise, and they're also still quite vulnerable. Whereas I check called with aces and pocket tens and also half the pocket jacks, because I think the aces and the tens can more comfortably check call because they're not as afraid of giving free cards. It's tricky. And I also even took a note right here, which is I like check raising kings and queens more than jacks, because I think in reality, in the ranges that I had the cutoff for betting pocket jacks, but I think I like that less now than I did, a couple months ago when I started making the range. And as I think I even mentioned when I was making the ranges, jacks might be a 4-bet if you're in the cutoff and the button 3-bets, but they're a call off the blinds 3-bet. And since the big blind has the most polarized 3-betting range of the blinds, the small blind 3-betting range is not polarized, whereas the big blind 3-betting range is. I think especially when the big blind 3-bets, the cutoff is going to more likely call with jacks. So because of that, I think check raising with the kings and the queens is a little bit better than with specifically pocket jacks. So yeah, basically half the good stuff was check raised, half the good stuff was check called. You'll notice there's only a 1-to-1 check raising, value check raising to check raise bluffing ratio on the flop. And the reason for that is in a 3-bet pot, you don't have that much stack depth. So you can't check raise bluff nearly as aggressively as you can in a single raise pot where you have a lot more stack depth to use. So because of that, that's why you see the 1-to-1 ratio. We're not going to get too into that right now, but that's stuff that's been talked about in other videos. And again, it's just an estimate. But I do think our check raise bluffs are quite good here. We have king queen, which is a gut shot and 2 overs. And then 8-7, which is an open-ended straight draw. And then 8-6 suited, which is the gut shot with 3 to a flush. I like playing some of my... So here, here's a good point where I'm check raising the open-ended straight draw here. And that's because if you look at how polarized this check raising range is, right? Like it has a very clear value component. The value component's right here, and it has a very clear bluff component, which is right here. Since that range is pretty polarized, I don't expect the opponent to 3-bet all that often. He might 3-bet sometimes to deny us our ability to realize our equity with our gut shots, but in reality, our check raising range is really polarized. Our opponent's not usually going to have hands that really want to 3-bet against our check raising range. So I think we can get away with check raising 8-7 because it's a high equity hand, and I don't think we're going to get 3-betted all that often. If I'm wrong there and our opponent is 3-betting aggressively, then we'd probably be better off check calling with 8-7, and then we could just replace it with some more check raise bluffs. But either way, as a general rule, the less I expect to get pushed off the high equity hand, the more I like putting it in the range that makes the pot bigger. So again, these are kind of oversimplifications, but all I'm saying is I think we're really usually going to get to realize the equity of our 8-7 suited. I think our opponent's usually going to defend by calling if he does defend. So that's why I preferred to check raise with the 8-7 rather than check call with it and then check raise bluff, a weaker hand. And also, at the end of the day, you might just not have the perfect hands to check raise bluff, especially in 3-bet pots. So, if I already check raise bluff the 8-6 suited, I don't have really any more gut shots other than king queen, and those have overcards, and I already am check raising half of those. So, so there's the check raising range, and then the check calling range, as I already mentioned, aces because they're just not really afraid of giving free cards, tens because they're not really afraid of giving free cards, and they block the opponent's tens. Our opponent could easily bet a 10 when we check to him, and then the check raise will be quite good when he has that. Jacks, half are going in each range. Jacks are obviously very vulnerable to check call. But I wanted to have some stronger hands in my check calling range, and as I already mentioned, no way to know for sure, but the reason why I did check raise kings and check call jacks is because I think our opponent can call our 3-bet preflop with jacks, and, check raising kings when our opponent has jacks is awesome. Whereas if we have jacks, our opponent can't have jacks. But I'm not really sure there. Ace-king, I think I like a lot as a check call. It's just a really good example of a hand that might, let's even look, how often is ace-king just still the best hand on the flop? I'm guessing pretty often. Got to proceed him flat. Sorry, moving everything around. So weak pair, 43.7% of the time. You always kind of want to be aware of that. Ace-king is still the best hand, just in showdown value, almost 60% of the time on the flop, which is crazy. So ace-king, I definitely don't want to fold. And if we are behind with ace-king, all the time we're going to draw it if we hit an ace or a king. So ace-king, I think, makes a really good hand to check call. So that's why I'm check calling with that. Ace-queen suited, same deal. And then king-queen, because it has 2 overcards and it has the gut shot, which is nice. 9-7 suited, it's going to be very tough to play 9-7 suited, but I don't really want to bet it, so I check called with it. And then ace-3 suited for same thing as 9-7 suited. if we turn an ace, we're obviously going to have 2 pair, and our opponent might have improved. And then it still is just a hand that has some showdown value and can occasionally, get a really good, really tricky hand if we turn a 3. So I'm defending 61% of the time, and our opponent can make a profitable bet on the flop, even if we check our entire range. So now the question is, and this is probably one of the most common questions I get asked, where someone will be like, hey, Matt, how aggressively do I need to defend when I have the weaker range and I check? And there's no real way to know. So if you want to look at this range right here, you can try to think of a hand that maybe I'm check folding that you think should be defended, but I can't think of any. We're defending all of these hands up here except for, oh, did I miss ace-jack suited? Okay, we're defending all these hands up here except for ace-jack suited. So let's actually talk ace-jack suited for a moment, because I do think I missed this when I was writing out the hand combos. I still don't know where it goes. So ace-jack suited might make a better check raise, but ace-jack suited could just be better than 8-6 suited. My guess is it is, but I'm really not confident with that at all, because ace-jack suited has 3 to a flush, 3 to a better flush. 8-6 suited has 3 to a flush too. 8-6 suited has a gut shot, which is better than 3 to a straight. But ace-jack suited has better overcards, whereas 8-6 suited has very crappy pairs. So I think ace-jack suited would be better than 8-6 suited, so I mean, I could do that. But I can't get too far off this 1-to-1 value to bluff check raising ratio. And that stuff's talked about in like the 2+2 book. It comes from a model. It's not perfect. But I just mean we can't get too bluff happy. And at the end of the day, I think this is a spot where I would have probably made a mistake here if I were actually playing before I looked at this. Because honestly, I just want to bet 8-6 suited and ace-jack suited. Those hands just make good bluffs. So if I'm actually playing, even if I think in theory I should never bet on this flop, or if I think I should very rarely bet on this flop, in reality, if we're playing, we want to think, okay, let's look at this guy's stats. If he folds a lot to c-bets or a reasonable amount of c-bets, maybe we should still bet ace-jack suited or 8-6 suited on the flop because they're the right types of hands to c-bet, and our opponent's really not going to know if we're never value betting on this flop, or our opponent's not going to know our exact strategy to exploit us, and he probably doesn't realize how much this flop should favor his range relative to ours. All right, so I just substituted ace-jack suited with I just substituted 8-6 suited with ace-jack suited. But yeah, that's the same thing I was just talking about. It's hard to tell if we should add more hands into our defending range, but I don't really see any. I would just kind of stick with what we have. I think our ranges are going to get too weak if we start defending more, and even this check calling range, it actually has 9 really good hands, but it's 45 combos total. So maybe we could, start check calling with a few more tricky hands, but I'm not completely in love with that. So yeah, if you wanna, there's no way to know exactly how much you need to check defend. If you think you could add in some more like ace queen off hands or some 8-6 suited hands, go for it. But I'm not convinced either way. So let's move on to the next board texture. And if you remember, this flop texture, our range had, I think, 54% equity, which was quite a lot. And we also just have a lot of really premium hands. We have the ace-king and the ace-queen in our range. So it really paid off that we 3-bet all of our ace-queen here. We have a lot of the really good hands. So what I did here is I bet all of our really strong hands. And I know we want to bet at a pretty high frequency here because our range does have more equity and has, all of the ace-king where our opponent has none. So I'm betting all of our ace-king and ace-queen. I am slow playing the pocket aces, but I'm betting all the ace-king and ace-queen. I did do that. I did make that mediocre betting range that I talked about before where I'm betting jacks and tens because I can get value from our opponent's nines and pocket tens. And, they're not that strong, but they're really vulnerable. So I decided to go ahead and bet them. And then I also bet ace-5, ace-3, ace-2 because I was thinking I don't need that many bluff catchers to check call with, as I'll show you in just a second. So I want some hands that can bet the flop and check call later. This is something that I've probably learned a lot more recently and didn't understand like when I was writing the 2+2 book. So you probably see me do this more in ranges now than if you look at the book or you look at like old videos and stuff like that. In reality, I think check calling ace-5 suited on the flop is totally fine, and I would look at your opponent's stats and often do that. It's not that big a deal whether or not you check call ace-5 suited or pocket kings, or if you check call both of them, but ace-5 suited does block an ace from the opponent, so I would emphasize, betting. I would emphasize betting the ace-5 suited because you're less likely to be beat if you have the ace, and check calling the kings because you're more likely to be beat, if you don't block an ace. So that's why we're doing that. The weak bets here were really tricky. So whenever I say something like king, queen, 7, it usually means I'm betting the king queen off with a club, so that's 6 combos. Then I'm betting king queen of hearts. So that's where those 7 combos come from. 8-7 suited. I should pause for a moment before we talk about that. So this board texture doesn't really give us all that many good semi-bluffing hands. So like even if the board was rainbow, like compared to ace-9-4 rainbow, if the board's ace-9-4 rainbow, then we have lots of like 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight stuff. Whereas when the board's ace-9-4, we still have the hearts, but we only have a third as many like runner flush draws. We actually do have flush draws, which are right here, but we don't have as many like weak bets that are like, not awful, because we just don't have as many backdoor flush draw type hands. So what ended up happening here is like, look, I'm betting 8-7 suited, which is 3, which means I'm betting 8-7 of spades. Let's click on it right here. Which is something that I don't love doing in 3-bet pots or even single raise pots, because I don't like betting hands that have this little equity. But realistically, we just don't have that many good hands to bluff with here, and we have a lot of good hands to value bet. So because of that, it kind of forces us to bluff with, I think, weaker hands than I would usually like. And I think if we're not bluffing with these types of hands, we're going to be really unbalanced and we can be exploited. In reality, once again, I would look at the opponent's stats. This is a board texture where I think we'll get a fair amount of folds by c-betting, but not like a crazy amount. So I don't really have a strong opinion for whether or not in reality you should bet 8-7 of spades. Like, look at your opponent's stats. But if you actually aren't betting a lot of these 3 to a straight without 3 to a flush hands, then your range is going to be way too weighted towards value. And that was something I noticed when writing out all the combos. So before writing out all the combos, if I was playing, and this still is kind of the correct answer, if someone said, do you bet 8-7 of spades on this flop? I'd probably be like, look at the guy's stats. I mean, I think you should be betting here pretty often, but it's a pretty weak hand. Whereas in reality now, and I could be wrong, I think we absolutely have to bet some of these hands on the flop. Otherwise, we're just not going to have nearly enough bluffs from a balance perspective. Yeah, we also, the ace-x suited didn't hit, they did hit. So it just gives us less hands to bluff with, and since there's a flush draw, we don't have as many backdoor flush draw hands. So that's why I'm betting with all this pretty crappy stuff. I still didn't bet all the king-queen, as I'm going to discuss right here. So note, there isn't really enough air to balance out the value bets with ace-king and ace-queen without betting at least some of the king-queen on the flop. Well, we did bet the king-queen. It's also pretty tricky here since ace-king and ace-queen may not be able to go bet on certain turns and rivers, but our bluffs are pretty awful here. Also, our value bets are probably more likely to be outdrawn than our bluffs are to improve. For example, ace-king might have 80% equity, whereas 7-6 of spades might only have realistically like 5, probably more than that, but 5% like robust equity. So I stuck with significantly less than the 3-2 bluffs to strong value betting ratio on the flop. So again, the ratio comes from a model. It's not perfect, but that was kind of the ratio that I've talked about in other videos where, if you're betting with a very polarized range in a 3-bet pot, you might want around 3 bluffs for every 2 value bets. Of course, in reality, our range is never perfectly polarized and stuff like position matters. But here specifically, our strong value bets, I mean, these things can realistically get outdrawn. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. But, I mean, they're going to get outdrawn by our opponent's flush draws. They're going to get outdrawn by our opponent's 9x hands. Whereas our weak bets, 8-7 of spades has more equity than 5%. But it really only has like 5% really robust equity, which is the runner straight draw. So here, since our value bets are good, but not like amazingly good, whereas our bluffs are pretty much crap, I'm using a lower bluffing to value betting ratio on the flop because I think our weak bets just aren't going to outdraw the opponent all that often. That's why I decided to bluff less aggressively than I usually do. So the next thing I wrote is also note there is a big jump in hand quality between 8-8 and 9x for our opponent. I think our flop betting range allows him to make plus EV calls with 9x, which probably have about 25% equity against some of our top pair, top kicker stuff, but 8-8 has significantly less equity. So I think our betting range right now allows him to make plus EV calls with all of his 9x hands, but not 8-8, which seems right. So everything seems pretty good at a glance there. I think a lot of times if you read a book like Mathematics of Poker, which I think is an awesome book and really cool, you realize that if you're talking about hands like on a number line where you can make as small of increments in hand strength as you want, that's a lot different than actual poker, right? Like in actual poker, there's a ginormous jump between pocket 8s and 9x for our opponent. And all I'm saying is with the range that I think I have right now, I think our opponent can call with pocket. I think our opponent can call with any 9x hand profitably, but he probably can't call with pocket 8s, which seems good. That seems normal here. So let's look at the checking range now. So I was able to bet here pretty aggressively, and as you can see, as I already talked about, I have about 1-to-1 strong bets to weak bets. And then the mediocre bets, those are the hands that we're going to bet the flop and sometimes check call the turn. We're not always going to check call, especially jacks and tens on the turn, but sometimes we might. So yeah, I think our betting range looks pretty good here, and we're betting 70% of the time. I checked 33 times, and I was able to defend 26 times. So that means we're defending 79% of our checks, which also means we're defending quite aggressively here. And then the checks that I'm defending are, I'm check raising 2 ace-4 suited hands. I'm check raising 2 6-5 suited hands with the, so one is with the backdoor flush draw and one is with the actual flush draw. So, I mean, I'm not really going to get that worried about balancing 4 combos, but you can see if I'm check raising a hand like 6-5 of clubs and 6-5 of hearts, I'm also trying to put more emphasis now than I used to on, hey, if I'm going to make the pot bigger by check raising, I want to try to use a hand with a reasonable amount of equity, even if I'm kind of semi-bluffing or bluffing with them. And especially since our check raising range is going to be pretty polarized, I don't think we're going to get 3-bet on the flop all that often, which means I'll pretty much get to realize the equity with these hands when I want to. So if I check raise with 7-6 of clubs and 6-5 if I check raise with 6-5 of clubs and 6-5 of hearts, I'm going to probably just check fold 6-5 of hearts if it doesn't improve on the turn, and then I'm going to pretty much always ship 6-5 of clubs on the turn, and then if 6-5 of hearts does improve, then I can ship that too. And when I say 6-5 of hearts improves, I mean usually to a flush draw or a straight draw. Okay, so check calling with pocket aces to slow play, ace jack suited, which I'll talk about in a minute, kings and queens, which I already talked about, king queen of clubs, just to check call one flush draw, and this one kind of keeps some dominated hands in our opponent's range if he does check back with like king jack or king queen, or at least splitting with king queen. And then 9-7 suited for like the only really middle pair hand we have. So I decided to check call that too. So right here I wrote, I decided to check call ace jack suited to make my check calling range a bit stronger and to give me a hand that can confidently bet big if the flop checks through and the turn doesn't come like the flush draw. I didn't see the point in check calling with more bluff catchers on the flop, but wanted some hands that could bet the flop and check call the turns, so I stuck with betting ace x suited. So all of this stuff is very tricky, and I could spend a lot more time on it, I think, to not really gain much from it. But all I'm really saying here is, like, I've already got the bluff catching component in the check calling range. The check calling range is, if we call kings and queens a bluff catcher and 9-7 suited a bluff catcher, and obviously 9-7 suited is more likely to outdraw the opponent when it's behind and is more likely to be outdrawn when it's ahead than something like kings or queens. But basically these 15 combos are bluff catchers. So 15 over 22, already 2/3 of my check calling range is just a bluff catcher. So I don't really think moving some of these like mediocre bets into the check calling range is going to really do much. And that's a mistake I think people make reasonably often, is when they're trying to get ranges to sort of click, or if if they're having problems with their ranges, it doesn't usually benefit a range that much to add more of a hand type where there's already a lot of them there. So like king queen of clubs, most of these hands, king queen of clubs is probably totally fine to bet that. There's nothing wrong with it, and I would definitely consider betting it when I'm playing and look at my opponent's stats. But the reason why I did check call with it is I'm like, hey, it gives me an air hand to bluff with later on if the flop checks through. The reason why I check called with ace jack suited is I'm like, hey, it gives me a hand that can kind of check call. So I'm not just check calling with like aces and nothing else that's like quite good. This hand gives me something that can check call down if I face 3 bets and the turn and the river are blank. And it also gives me a hand that can bet kind of big if the flop checks through and the turn card comes, let's say a 3 of spades. Because remember, if we check the flop and the flop check through, we were checking with pocket aces now and ace-4 suited and ace-jack suited, and our opponent wouldn't likely check a strong hand back on the flop, and he didn't improve on a 3 of spades turn, so we might decide to bet kind of big with some hands. So that's why you see me having some of these like fancy hands in here. In reality, I don't think it's that big a deal. It's just me trying to get things to click when I'm, working on stuff away from the tables, like I did, between me making my original guess and then pausing it to write all this stuff out. So yeah, this is our check calling range, and it seems I like it, and we're defending our checks pretty aggressively. So if our opponent does bet this flop after we check, he does not make an immediate profit, which is good to see because our range is stronger than his here. We have more equity, and we have the better distribution of equity. So yeah, pretty tricky flop. You can pause here and look at the whole range if you want for a second, and just really notice that so many of these hands that I put in one range or the other, I think you can easily move them around based on your opponent's stats. And that's definitely not always the case. Like a lot of times, there'll be one line with a hand that's just the GTO line, and you would need such an insane read to not take the appropriate line with it. I mean, I don't think I need to give you an example, but like there's some times where it's just like, if you take any line on the flop other than raising, it's bad against almost any reasonable villain. This isn't the case at all here. There's a lot of hands that I think you could shift them around, so I would really think before I just bluffed with these hands. I would really think before I check called with ace jack or with king queen, the king queen of clubs, or even with something like 9-7 suited. So just be aware of that here. Specifically on this board texture, I think there's a lot of hands that could go either way, and one line could be quite a bit better based on your opponent's tendencies. And that's definitely not always the case. So now let's do the final board texture, which is the king queen 5 rainbow. And I thought this board texture was actually kind of cool, because I remember saying how I would usually just bet all my king X, check all my queen X, and be like, close enough for government work, we're good to go. That didn't work out. I mean, it would still work out pretty well here, but it didn't work out as awesomely as I would like, and I kind of want to explain why in just a moment. So let's first look at the small blind 3-betting range. The small blind 3-betting range is what a lot of people would call a linear 3-betting range. So here we kind of just have like all of our best hands, so it's very easy for us to just be like, hey, let's bet, all of our king X, and then let's check call with all our medium pair, which I have highlighted right now. So ace queen, queen jack suited, queen 10 suited, and queen 9 suited. And that I think will work pretty well. Whereas our big blind 3-betting range was more polarized. So we didn't have, like, other than ace queen, which is like a really good queen X hand, we didn't have any of the queen jack, queen 10, queen 9. So I think that made it a little bit trickier, because what I found out was happening is if I didn't bet any ace queen on the flop, and you can see I highlighted the mediocre bets for ace queen, if I didn't c-bet any of these ace queen on the flop, it made it very hard for me to bet the flop and then check call the turn, because what hand would really fit that role? If I bet on the flop with aces or ace king, I'm pretty much going to bet the turn the vast majority of the time. So I don't really have any hands that can bet flop, check call turn kind of comfortably unless I bet some ace queen on the flop. I mean, kind of cool. I hadn't really thought of it like that before. So I decided to bet some ace queen on the flop with the intention to check call. And then also, tying into what I just said a minute ago, look at the check calling range down here. I know I'm going over stuff really fast, and we're going to go over it again in just a second. But if you look at the check calling range, I already have, like I'm going to highlight it right now. I'm check calling 23 combos, and I have 15 combos. So again, 2/3 of my check calling range is just straight up a bluff catcher. Pocket tens, half of the combos. Pocket jacks and ace queen, they're just straight up bluff catchers. I already have 2/3 bluff catchers in my check calling range. Is my check calling range really going to benefit from me adding in more bluff catchers? I don't really think so. So I decided to say, hey, let's split the ace queen. Let's bet half and check call half. That way I have some hands that can bet the flop and check call on the turn. I like that. Again, in reality, I'm saying if I'm betting half the ace queen and I'm check calling half the ace queen, I'm saying I think they're a mixed strategy, which sounds reasonable to me. So I would look at my opponent's stats and then decide what I want to do based on that. So we're doing a lot of mixed strategies here in 3-bet pots because I'm talking about, I think, the more interesting close spots. But please don't get in the mindset of thinking, oh, so Matt just basically said there's mixed strats everywhere, adjust to your opponent, doesn't really matter what you do in general. No. Very often a hand has one line that's the best, and you should always take that line. I'm just focusing on the spots where I think there are mixed strats, and since we have fewer hand combos in our range, since it is a 3-bet pot and we 3-bet specifically against the cutoff, I think you're seeing mixed strategies a little bit more often. Anyways, I think ace queen is a mixed strat. And I'd rather bet with ace queen, for example. I'd for sure rather bet with ace queen than bet with pocket jacks. So that's why I check call all my jacks and then I bet with half my ace queen. So for example, I don't think jacks is a mixed strategy. I think betting with jacks on the flop pretty much sucks. Could be wrong, but I think it's bad, so I wouldn't do it. The weak bets here. So here we have three to a flush. Sorry, not three to a flush. Here we have a rainbow flop. So it's very easy for us to have three to a flush. So I'm going to highlight all this junk. And I think all this is just, some of it has gut shots, but not too many. No, none of it's gut shots. These are all no gut shots, three to a flush, a lot of it three to a straight stuff. So this is a board texture where it's kind of easy, I think, to c-bet bluff effectively because you're just going to bet a lot of hands like 6-4 of diamonds on the flop, and then you just barrel when you improve. And again, when I say improve, I usually mean a flush or a straight draw, seeing as it's a 3-bet pot. I'm also c-betting some of the weak pairs that can just improve to like trips or 2 pairs, which I think is pretty normal. Ace-5 suited, I'm even c-betting too. So yeah, I think everything should seem really normal here. Like I think this really is a board where it's really easy to design a betting range. There's no draws here, and then I'm betting 62% of the time. Again, it seems very reasonable. I'm checking 40 combos, and I'm defending. This should be 29, so I math failed somewhere. Give me 1 second. Okay, this was supposed to be 26. This should have been 20. So I forgot to take out 3 combos earlier, but the relevant math is right. So I check raised the pocket queens, and then I check raised the 6-5 suited and the 5-4 suited. That's something that I kind of learned from Poker Snowy, which I like, is just, hey, if I'm check raising sets and air, then I don't see how my opponent's really going to 3-bet. Like, think about it. What would you 3-bet against me if you knew my check raising range was sets and some bluffs? Nothing's that effective to 3-bet me with. So because of that, I can put some of these, pretty good hands into the check raising range. I can put some really high equity hands. Yeah, they'd make good c-bets too, but I think they make good check raise bluffs. So I decided to go ahead and check raise bluff them. Also, as I mentioned earlier, I like the fact that if I don't like it when I like c-bet with a hand, then I have to fold it when my opponent ships the turn. So one thing that's kind of cool about check raising with like 6-5 of hearts is if it checks through on the flop, yeah, that's not ideal, but this hand can still definitely improve and has some showdown value. But if our opponent bets, I'm pretty much going to get to realize the equity, right? I can't really get pushed off the hand. Whereas if I c-bet with 6-5 of hearts, I think it's a little more common for me to c-bet. My opponent calls, turn comes at 2 of hearts, I bet again, he ships, and then I go, ugh. So yeah, anyways, I'm check raising. I'm just putting more of an emphasis on it, check raising some high equity hands that could, they're strong enough to definitely go in other ranges. Whereas that's something I used to do a little bit less, I think. All right, so check calls. Check calling 3 king queens as like the really strong hand. Okay, cool. Check calling half the ace queen we already talked about. Check calling all the jacks. I decided to just check call with half the 10s. I don't really know if check calling with 10s and check folding with 10s is a mixed strat, but it might be. And then I also check called with ace jack suited because, compared to pocket 10s, ace jack suited obviously has like much more robust equity. Ace jack suited is just drawing to the gut shot, whereas 10s are drawing to a set, and even the set's a little bit tainted. And I wanted some hands that could check call on the flop and then be used as a bluff later, so that's why I put ace-jack suited here. They also might make a good check-raise bluffing hand. So like, for example, let's say we check call the flop with ace-jack of spades, and the turn is an 8 of spades. If our opponent bets again, maybe we check ship with our pocket queens and ace-jack of spades. And that might actually be pretty balanced. So little detailed stuff that I don't think is that big a deal. In reality, if you have ace-jack suited and you 3-bet pre-flop, look at your opponent's stats and decide whether or not you want to c-bet here. But a lot of the reason why I do these exercises is because you want to like start seeing what might be correct and at least start considering options more. So you want to be able to see a flop texture that's, similar to this, and then, really quickly consider like, okay, you know what, maybe I should actually check call with ace-jack suited because that hand has some robust equity and it gives me a hand that can bluff later if after check calling if my opponent checks back the turn. Whereas if you do what a lot of people do, like a lot of people might, like I think what would be more common is for people to literally just check call the flop with a range that looks like this, ace, queen, jacks, and 10s. And you might not really get punished too much if you do use just that check calling range, but you can clearly see how that's exploitable. It's unbalanced. You don't really have anything to bluff with later if, you bet if you check call the flop and the turn checks through. You also don't really have anything that can value bet too efficiently later, but, ideally, you would not call on the flop with a range that's that transparent, where your opponent just kind of can know almost exactly what you have. Whereas this range I have is a little bit more resistant to overbets because we do have king, queen. So it gives us some hands that can defend very aggressively against additional barrels. And then since we have, this really good hand in it, it also has a component in it which can bluff later. Okay, so the note is we don't have other queen X hands in our range, and we can get value from ace queen by betting. So I bet and check some ace queen and check called all the jacks. This also allows us to bet the flop and have some hands to check call with on the turn. So yeah, already discussed all that. So hopefully that should be pretty clear. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to randomly generate some more flops just so we can cover a little bit more ground. And give me feedback in the forums, but I kind of like this video setup where I go through the first time without writing out all the hand combos, trying to be like, okay, in practice, what do I think I'm going to do? Then afterwards, I do some stuff off the screen, then show it. So let me know what you guys think of that, because I'm kind of digging this. But for the last 10 minutes, I'm just going to bang out some random flops, and we're going to try to apply the concepts that we just talked about to the new flops. All right, so King Jack 4. So one of the cool things about doing stuff like this is you're just going to see so many. You could probably do like 10 flop textures if you wanted, and almost every flop texture you could randomly generate would be reasonably close to 1 or 2 that you have. So anyways, this King Jack 4 is not all that different than the King Queen 5. The main difference is actually really that it's a flush draw here rather than a rainbow flop. So that means we have to try harder to bluff with some like pretty crappy bluffs. I think that would be the main difference. The other main difference would be is, I guess, we don't hit with our ace queen. So that actually might be pretty significant. So our ace queen doesn't hit. Our ace jack suited does, but that's still less combos. So this means it's going to favor our opponent's range more than I think the King Queen 5 did. So actually, let's look. My initial impression was wrong. This board might be quite a bit different. So the 3-betting range had 52.7% equity on this flop. And then after talking it through, I was thinking it's going to have, I think the jack's actually going to be quite a bit worse for us. So let's guess 50%? Okay. Yeah, so the jack is, I guess, quite a bit worse. But it's still an overall similar board texture to the last one. Just worse because we don't have as many ace queens. So now, it's going to be even harder for us to check call the turn after betting the flop. So what I would say we do here is like, the difference is here, now we can bet pocket queens. So it's going to be still kind of similar to the last board where I want some hands that can bet the flop and check call the turn. And I think queens are going to be that hand. So I would check call with ace jack on the flop. I think I would bet with queens and then check call them on the turn. And then I think I would still check call with tens on the flop, even though I don't love it. But I think they still work pretty well. And then I'm trying to think if I'm missing anything else. King queen, I think I'm most... King Queen is kind of weird here because I don't think we can get 3 streets of value by betting King Queen because we lose to King Jack. I could be wrong though. King Queen's got to be close because the only hands that really beat us in our opponent's range are, I guess, our pocket jacks if he has them, which he probably does, and King Jack. So yeah, King Queen, I would definitely bet Ace King on the flop and aces. King Queen might be kind of mixed where we can bet some and check call later, or bet some for all 3 streets if we get blanks, or we can even check call it on the flop. So yeah, this board actually, I'm going to backtrack a little bit what I said. This board might actually be a pretty interesting one to do. All right, I've talked too much. I'm in too deep. I'm going to just do it, and then I'll show it. So yeah, so to just make a guess so I can be wrong and kind of learn a little bit more from doing it, I think we are going to be betting queens on the flop and check calling them later. I think we're going to be check calling on the flop with ace jack and pocket tens. I think king queen is going to be part of some mixed strat, and then I think we're going to be value betting the aces and ace king. We're probably going to be check raising or check calling with the pocket jack. We're probably going to be check raising the pocket jacks, check calling with the pocket kings, and then I think it's going to be a little bit harder to find bluffs here because just like I talked about before, we don't really call draws bluffs, and we got the flush draws, but we don't have that many backdoor flush draw stuff. We just have the clubs, and there's not that many combos of that. So it's going to be a little bit tricky to bluff here. All right, so I'll just make the board. All right, so here are all the combos written out for the last hand, and I think this one was actually the trickiest of the ones so far. So I'm betting the aces, ace, king, and most of the king, queen. I looked it up, and the cutoff really doesn't have, let's look at the cutoff 3-bet fat. The cutoff really doesn't have king, queen beat very often. The cutoff has king, queen beat only 8% of the time on the flop, so not really beat often at all. So king, queen is definitely fine to bet, but the problem is, it's the same thing that was happening before, which I didn't realize how much of a problem it was until I watched this video, made this video, which is it's really hard to find good bluffing hands on a board texture where there's a flush draw. Because if you look, these are the flush draws I'm betting. Luckily here we can kind of bet ace queen as like a bluff. I would rather just bet ace queen as like a high equity bluff rather than check call it. I think it's not going to work out as well to check call with ace queen here, even though I don't completely hate it. But the other problem is if we're not betting ace queen, it's like, what are we bluffing with here? This board's just going to give our opponent like a lot of pairs plus draws stuff. We can again look at the cutoff 3-bet flatting range. You know, he's going to have a lot of he has middle pair or better 36%. He's going to have a gut shot or better another 35%. So he's going to have a lot of hands that can call a flop bet. And it's just really hard to know what we're bluffing with here if we don't bluff with ace queen. So even though I can see an argument for check calling ace queen, like, hey, we've got a gut shot, we have some showdown value, we might have a backdoor flush draw. And I did check call ace queen of clubs and ace queen of spades. I think we're going to have to mostly bet ace queen, because if we don't bet with ace queen, our bluff quality just gets so incredibly low when we bet the flop. So I bet with all of our ace queen, all the hands that have a backdoor flush draw, which is 10 combos. I bet with 5-4 suited and 6-4 suited. 2 of those combos each, and then all of the ace-4 suited. So yeah, I don't think there's a better solution that I can think of right off the top of my head, though. It'll give me something to think about a little bit more over the next couple weeks, but it just seems like it's hard to find good hands to c-bet bluff with this range, even if on a board texture where there is a flush draw. So this is similar to what we were talking about earlier, where here, you know, these hands are going to get outdrawn sometime. The ace is the ace king and the king queen. No doubt about that. But I still would like to have some more bluffs in this bluffing range, but I don't, like, there's a huge jump, I think, in bluff quality between the bluffs that I have and the next bluff I could add. Because the next bluff I could add would be like 6-5 of hearts. And I mean, just like, let's just click it. But 6-5 of hearts is just so much worse than, I think, 5-4 of hearts. 6-5 of hearts is just so much worse than ace queen. So it's like, I want to have more bluffs because I think our betting range is strong, especially since I bet the queens. But by the same token, I just don't think I want to add in bluffs that are that bad when it's so easy for our opponent to call our flop bet. So yeah, when you're actually trying to write out stuff and get things to sort of balance reasonably well, a lot of times there's just not a perfect solution. I think that's the case here. I can't see a way to really improve this without... Yeah, I don't see a way to really improve this range very easily. Betting most of the flush draws is simple enough, and we're betting 64% of the time. We're betting 72 combos on the flop, which again seems reasonable given that we've seen how rarely king queens beat on the flop, and our range has, you know, 6 pocket aces, all of the ace king, and then a whole bunch of king queen too. So I think betting at a high frequency here is fine. Total checks, we're checking 40, and we're defending about 60% of our checks. So this was also hard to do. And I also don't love the fact that we're check calling with a 6 of our check calling range is like the nuts. But I don't really like doing much else with pocket kings because of the huge removal effect. We're already check raising pocket jacks and some bluffs. I also ended up check calling with some king queens just so we could have some more hands that could check call. Then I check called with some ace queen hands and some sort of air hands. And then ace jack suited and 10s are our bluff catchers. So here it was really hard to actually make like the check calling range have... be mostly composed of bluff catchers, because the only real bluff catchers on this flop are like literally, I think, ace jack suited, pocket 10s, and you can argue pocket queens, even though I like them more as a bet, which is why I bet with them. But so our check calling range is pretty narrow because we just don't have that many medium strength hands that can check call. So that's why you see this check calling range right here. But even though we're only check calling with ace jack suited and pocket 10s as our bluff catcher, they still make up half of our check calling range. So yeah, go ahead and take a good look at this range. I don't really see a way I would really improve this very easily, but I definitely think this is the range that I like the least. And I just think, you know, at the end of the day, you sometimes just get a flop texture where things don't work out that well. And here, because we got a king, which gives us a lot of really strong hands, and a jack, which gives us like almost no medium strength hands, but puts a lot of medium strength hands in the opponent's range, it just made it, I think, a lot more awkward to sort of balance our checking range, though I think I did a pretty decent job. We're still defending 57% of our checks, and we still do have 50% of our check calling range composed of bluff catchers. Yeah. So I hope you enjoyed watching the video. I hope you took some stuff from it. Again, let me know if you liked this format with me kind of going over stuff at a glance and then actually writing out the combos, then me coming back to talk about it. Yeah, I think the one thing that you hopefully kind of took from this video is, especially in 3-bet pots, there's probably a whole lot of mixed strategies. If you actually play with a program like Poker Snowy, they use mixed strategies a lot more than even I'm using them, which I think is a little bit much. But there's no doubt there's a ton of mixed strategies in actual poker, and I'm sure a GTO player would use tons and tons and tons of mixed strategies. So yeah, hopefully you saw how many mixed strategies there probably are, and how, if you actually have reads on your opponents, you can take one line or the other, but in theory, you probably have to take a combination of both. And then also, hopefully you can see how, especially in 3-bet pots, when you use the polarized range, it's hard to be like, oh, I would like to bluff some more hands, or oh, I would like to check call some more hands, because you don't always have that right hand type. Like right here, I would like to check call some more bluff catchers. I just don't have them in my range, and that doesn't mean I did anything wrong pre-flop. I also would like to bluff a little bit more on the flop. I just don't have any hands that really make good c-bet bluffs. And while I could start putting in some really, really, really crappy bluffs, in reality, I think if I do that, I'm going to lose money with those hands, because my opponent's going to call with so many hands. He gets a good price. He gets like 2 or 3 to 1, probably closer to 3 to 1. He's going to call with so many hands where I need to have some equity with my bluffs to make them profitable. So here I end up betting a range that's a little bit stronger than I'd like, because I just don't have any more of the right types of hands to bluff with. So yeah, definitely makes things trickier in 3-bet pots, and that's something we'll have to deal with more with a polarized range, whereas if we have the more linear range, I think if I had this range right here, I don't think I'd have a problem pretty much finding all the right hands to check call with, or finding more hands. It'd still be a little bit trickier, but I think I'd be able to find a lot more hands to, c-bet bluff with as well. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed watching the video. Hopefully you guys learned some stuff. Give me the comments and the feedback in the forums, and I'll look forward to the next one. All right, take care, guys, and good luck. Bye.